What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Guys, we are here. Somebody asked for me to check out the Swedish Navy. And I was saying I was going to check out the Swedish Navy after checking out the Swedish submarine. And I found this from the channel Hidden History. The Swedish Navy in World War II. So we checking this out. And this is a recent video, because it was 3 months ago, so it wasn't nothing like 10 years ago or nothing like that. But we checking this out and seeing some history of the Swedish Navy in World War II, man. Because I don't know much how they played, what part they played in this war. So let's check it out. And y'all let me know how accurate it is.
Sweden has an impressive naval tradition, particularly by Scandinavian standards. From the 1700s to early 1900s, the powerful Swedish Navy, or Sverige Marinen, had only one other naval power in the Baltic that was its rival, the Russian Navy. It's worth noting right away that it was Russia that had been Sweden's biggest enemy for literally centuries, an antagonism that would endure into the Second World War. On the other hand, also worth noting is that Sweden had enjoyed excellent relations with Germany to its south. That was the case even long before Germany unified into a single country in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck. Swedish naval officers had very often trained in German academies, spoke German, and had an affinity for German culture. Those close ties between Sweden and Germany didn't suddenly disappear at the outbreak of World War II. They lingered, as we shall see. Sweden's navy had been quite severely downsized during the period between the First and Second World Wars. The naval budget in the 1920s and early 1930s had been cut in half compared to before World War I. The country had endured an interwar financial crisis, made only worse by the Great Depression. But there was another reason why naval and military budgets generally had waned during this time. That reason was pacifism. More than any other European country, Sweden became a resolutely pro-peace country after World War I and a leading proponent of using the League of Nations to resolve conflicts between countries. Pacifism was huge in Sweden leading up to World War II, even as the country...
And I believe... if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Sweden neutral during those wars as well?
Retained pride in its rich naval history. Nevertheless, the Swedish Navy still retained a sizable navy by 1939, even if not as large as what it had in the late 1800s, and even during World War I, its naval high command could count on well-trained officers and sailors who numbered 409,000 men, respectively, and a clear-headed vision.
That looked like an AI picture
Of what the country needed of its navy. This high command was led by Vice Admiral Claes Fabian Tam as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, with Rear Admiral Helga Hjalmar Strömbeck as his Chief of the Staff and Major General J.H. Astrom as the head of coastal defense. The fact that Sweden's Navy had a dedicated head of coastal defense at the highest level should tell you everything about where its naval emphasis lay.
Right.
Although Sweden did possess a so-called blue water navy, it was for all intents and purposes a mostly green water navy. As its name implies, a green water navy refers to a navy that focuses primarily on river and coastal defenses, while a blue water navy evokes a navy on the high seas and out in the oceans. A green water navy is by its very nature a more defensive one, since the focus is on coastal and inland waterways. Having a more green water navy that was highly defensive...
That's something new. Because, you think the Navy just the Navy, they put them a special wherever they put them. But we got the green water and the blue water, which makes sense, after being in Sweden. Lots of water. Everywhere I went, it seemed like it was water everywhere. And not just water as in, like, there's a beach there. It was a lot of water out there.
And inland waterways. Having a more green water navy that was highly defensive meant that Sweden was exceptionally well armed with submarines, torpedoes, and torpedo boats. They could inflict serious damage on any invading navy. These defenses
Wow.
were boosted by some of the
Torpedo boats.
strongest coastal fortifications of any country in Europe. Invading Sweden by sea would be a foolhardy venture,
Oh, man.
and the Germans knew it. In terms of surface ships, Sweden mostly relied on its armored coastal battleships, including the HSWMS Oscar II, built in 1905. Also in use were 3 ships of the 1919 to 1920 Sverige class, 4 vessels of the Aaron
Sverige.
class, built between 1901 and 1903, and the HSWMS
1901?
Dristigheten, which was commissioned in 1900. They were undoubtedly outdated, even ancient by World War II battleship standards. Yet these coastal battleships were still armed
Man.
with heavy guns and protected by full armor, citadels, conning towers,
That looked like a British flag
and
at the end of that
equipped
one.
with powerful anti-aircraft machinery. Still, they lacked radar and were still small ships when comparing their highest tonnage of 8,500 tons to monster battleships of the time, such as Germany's Bismarck, with its massive 50,000 tons. Sweden did have a few larger naval vessels as part of its navy. It possessed 3 armored ships, the Sverige, or Sweden,
Sverige.
the Gustav V, named after the country's
Gustav.
king who had been monarch since 1907, and the Drottning Victoria, or Queen Victoria, named after
they
his
got a
wife,
Queen Victoria.
who herself was German-born. They were not new vessels, having been built in the late 1910s, but they were well armed with 4 28-centimeter guns and had been modernized several times leading up to 1939. The Navy also possessed some smaller ships of Italian origin. During the war,
Not
it would
Italy.
acquire MAS torpedo boats from Italy.
Man.
By the mid to late
A torpedo boat. Jeez.
1930s,
I wanna
even
see those in
Sweden
action.
became disillusioned and increasingly alarmed by Adolf Hitler's insistence on German rearmament, followed by his vociferous demands regarding German expansionism, particularly to the east. Sweden may have still had strong pacifist leanings, but its government knew it needed to invest more in its armed forces, particularly its navy, and that it did with the passing of its naval rearmament legislation of 1936. Investments, although not
Dang.
massive,
So these are all that they got. 1909, 1918, 26, 31. Man, them things just kept getting bigger and bigger by the time, huh?
did grow in different classes of vessels, which were given alphabet letter designations by the Swedish Navy. These included the designation A for auxiliary vessels and special service vessels, J for destroyers, F for frigates, K for corvettes, and M for minesweepers and
the
mine
corvettes.
layers. The letter P was the designation for patrol boats, R for guided missile boats, T for motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, and V for picket boats. Lastly, like their German counterparts, the Swedes designated U for submarines, or ubåt as they were called in Swedish.
U-boats.
The Swedish Navy would add 3
U-boats.
new destroyer classes to its fleet during the war. These included 4 vessels of the Mode class, launched in 1942, 4 vessels of the Visby class, launched between 1942 and 1943, and 2 units of the Uland class, launched late in the war in 1945. That meant the Navy had 30 destroyers in total by war's end, making Sweden by
Dang.
far the strongest of the green-water navies during World War II. It also added 16 submarines and 11 patrol
They
ships
added a
to its
lot.
fleet between 1941 and 1945, as well as 23 new minesweepers.
It seems like they already had these in the works, getting them, of course, built, occupied, and get whatever they need on it. Like they already had them in the works.
During
to go
the
ahead
war,
and make that
Swedish
happen.
ships were famously painted in zigzag camouflaged livery. This camouflage was well adapted to the many islands that dotted its southern coast.
The
Their
camouflage
ships
boats?
also sported white neutrality bands that were painted at the stern and aft of the hull just to reinforce the country's defensive-minded neutrality to other nations, particularly the Germans and the Soviets.
That's interesting.
We cannot forget that Sweden was highly weary of possible invasion too by the Soviet Union, building on its centuries of mistrust of what was Imperial Russia. There is no denying that the German Wehrmacht could have overrun Sweden in a matter of weeks, although even that might have dragged on for months. After all, Sweden is a country dense with thick forests, large marshes, and hundreds of lakes, perfect for defensive guerrilla warfare. However, even that could have eventually been nullified by Germany's formidable Luftwaffe. No, what must have been a big turnoff for the Germans was Sweden's Green River Navy, and in particular its impressive coastal artillery. The country's heavily fortified coastal artillery had been modernized for more than a decade with both Swedish artillery and that imported from countries such as Czechoslovakia. What had been the coastal defensive line of Skåne became the Per Albin Line during World War II, named after the country's prime minister at the time and the man who had declared Swedish neutrality from day one. That defensive line alone was 500 kilometers or 310 miles in length and ran along the southern coast of Sweden. This line actually consisted of two tiers of defensive lines, the first being comprised of concrete bunkers and light gunnery emplacements along the shore, with the second line comprised of entrenched troops some 300 meters or 1,640 feet inland. Those troops were sequestered.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, these things are still up. There's a country somewhere, I believe it's somewhere in Europe. It might be Poland. Maybe it's Poland. But they still got like active landmines out there.
Behind mines and barbed wire and the odd concrete bunker. New coastal artillery units, including the Blekinge, Gothenburg, Gotland, Norrland, and Stockholm coastal artillery defense units, were built in 1942. It's not hard to conclude that all these new artillery batteries were a signal sent by the Swedish to the Germans that the country was best left alone. By the end of the war, 60 coastal artillery batteries had been built all along the Swedish coast. No invading force would happily contend with that. Sweden's coastal defense also included extensive fortifications among the numerous islands which lead into the entries of her two largest cities, Stockholm and Gothenburg. She also had her large naval base at Karlskrona on the southeast coast of the country, and which remains Sweden's largest naval base to this day. These fortifications had Swedish-made artillery that included 40mm anti-aircraft automatic guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, and 6 to 12-inch cannons. There's another reason why Sweden knew it could protect itself as a defensively minded neutral country. It has to do with armaments. Unlike many European countries, Sweden did not have to depend on other countries to manufacture its armaments. Instead, it could count on its own manufacturing at the famous factories of AB Bofors in the town of Karlskoga in southern central Sweden. Bofors had been an arms manufacturer for more than 300 years and was renowned for its excellent designs and sturdy builds. Indeed, the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun had even been mass-produced in huge quantities under license by Britain in 1938 and by the United States in 1940, and the cannon was deployed on nearly all Allied ships. As an aside, in the aftermath of the First World War, Bofors had secretly helped Krupp, the German manufacturing giant, to keep developing and making arms, even as the German company was prohibited to so under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Swedish ability to play all sides in military matters was indeed relentless. Sweden's navy relied almost entirely on its homemade armaments, itself a great source of national pride and strategic advantage for the navy and all the country's armed forces.
I'm sure they were building these things fast. They were manufacturing these things pretty fast.
Factor 2 played its part in ensuring 300 years neutrality in World War II. Also, made in Sweden were the thousands of mines that the country's mine layers laid down all along the country's coast. These mines were also critically important to the country's coastal defense. The Swedish Navy ensured that this giant minefield was kept at enough distance from shore so that merchant ships could ply their all-important trade to and from Sweden. So,
Man.
was Sweden including its navy as neutral as it proclaimed itself to be? It's a critically important question because it defined everything that Sweden and the Swedish navy...
See, that's why just hearing history when it comes to the wars in Sweden, I heard they were neutral, but it's like they were still prepared. They stayed prepared. It's like, yeah, we're going to be neutral, but we're also not going to be stupid enough to think, we're good. No, you always got to stay ready.
Navy
Seemed
did
like they
during
stayed
all
ready.
of World War II. Let's look at some of the facts regarding its neutrality. Sweden did assist the Allies, primarily its Scandinavian neighbors. For example, the Swedes helped train refugee soldiers from Denmark and Norway and shared military intelligence, particularly naval intelligence, with the military leadership of both its neighbors. Sweden also took in thousands of Jewish refugees and political dissidents from both of those countries. The Americans were also allowed to use Swedish air bases between 1944 and 1945, although it could be argued that the Swedish only did so because it was already clear by then that the Allies were winning the war. Then there was the German telegraph traffic between Berlin and Oslo in occupied Norway, which had to go through Swedish cables. The Swedes intercepted this traffic and were able to decipher the encrypted German messages. They then dispatched these deciphered messages to the Allies in London via the Polish resistance movement. It was Swedish intelligence that informed the Allies about when the German battleship Bismarck was to embark on her voyage to attack Allied convoys in the Atlantic. However, Sweden also repeatedly aided Nazi Germany. For example, Sweden sold iron ore to Germany throughout the war.
Yeah, I heard
there
that.
were even German-owned mines in Sweden called Tyskgruvorna, or German mines, that were allowed to keep operating under German control. Exports of Swedish iron ore to Germany, so critical for Germany's war effort, reached 10 million tons per year during the war. It also allowed Germany's Wehrmacht to use its infrastructure during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June and July of 1941. The German 163rd Infantry Division used Swedish railways to transport troops and heavy weapons from occupied Norway via Sweden to get to Finland in order to invade the USSR. Finland had aligned itself with Germany after having been invaded by the Soviets at the end of 1939. Until 1943, German soldiers on leave from Norway were allowed passage through Sweden to get to Germany with what was called permitten traffic. Whatever critical historians may say, it would be fair to say that Sweden did remain mostly neutral during World War II. It may of course have had some affinity with the Allies, but it was not as stridently anti-German as many other European countries were. And it remained very weary of the Soviet Union, even if that country became a part of the Allies from 1941. Winston Churchill was very disparaging of Swedish neutrality during the war. The British Prime Minister famously said that Sweden had ignored the greater moral issues of the war and played both sides for profit with her neutrality. It's hardly a surprising condemnation by Churchill, a man who, after all, never met a war he didn't love. Neutrality in war is always very contentious. But perhaps in the end, the Swedish government, as well as the Swedish Navy, did what was in the best interest of the country and its people.
Right. I feel like that's always something to consider. It's like we still got to do what's best for our people. That's the number one thing. We got to think about us first. Then we'll lean some of that thinking about everybody else, But like I said, I think it's almost like what would have happened if they wasn't neutral? Would the war have been even bigger than it was? Will it be even more deaths than it was? When you just think, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, Finland was neutral as well. But just think if these countries wasn't neutral, and who would help the Allies and the different things like that. Who's gonna help this country? Who's allies with this country? How this will go? How that will go? It's something you just think about. But history is history. With the what ifs, there's what ifs out there. But the Swedish Navy, it seems like, and even to this day, they stay prepared. got the highest technology out there, especially with those submarines, man. But this was interesting. Y'all let me know what y'all think in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button. That's all I had. Send down those recommendations, and y'all be blessed, be the best, and be you. I'm out.